Okay, so both the Black Death, the plague, and then the Great Dying in the Americas in the 16th century, again, can be placed in the context of the early modern world, the biological old regime, because in addition to the limitations on life and history that nitrogen places, one of the other limiting factors is, in fact, epidemic disease. Epidemic disease is a very, very serious historical agent at various times. And nature can and does have agency. It's not just that humans make history all the time. And there's a number of ideas that are behind the use of epidemic disease as a tool to think about world history. One of them is, and this was put together by William McNeill, the guy who did The Rise of the West, but he also did a book called Plagues and Peoples. And he argued that, 500 BC or thereabouts, 2,500 years ago, there were what he called in the world 5 separate disease pools. That the people who lived in these ecumenical areas, China, Africa, West Europe, the Americas, had their own sets of diseases that came from animals and others, and they became accustomed to them, and there's adaptation to both the pathogens, and then the pathogens adapt. And so there's some adjustment going on. Over time, as a result of global interactions, but especially trade and those linkages of trade around the world that link parts of the world together, not only goods and people travel on those trade links, but epidemic diseases of all kinds. And when one disease that arises in one disease pool gets taken to another part of the world that doesn't have that disease, it is what epidemiologists called a what the heck is I'm blanking on it. But the idea is that they haven't had it before, and it just spreads like wildfire. So in these two instances, the Black Plague, we have an instance where the plague bacillus is transmitted from Asia, in particular in China, and we now know exactly where, through Central Asia because of the Mongol Empire and the trade routes that were there, and gets into Europe for the first time in about 800 years. There had been evidence of a plague during toward the end of the Roman Empire is pretty well gone by then, but in the 6th century, it's known as the Justinian plague. But for all intents and purposes, Europeans and others had no experience with it. Then there's a similar, the Columbian exchange. Clearly, we've got the exchange of pathogens from Europeans into native peoples of the Americas. Again, 2 disease pools coming into contact with the people who don't have experience with those diseases being pretty well devastated as well. Now, before we get on to the Black Death and the documents that I'll give you to take a look at with this, mostly the story of the Black Death has been told as a story about what happened to Europe and what happened to Europeans. What we now know as a result of work that's been done over the last 20 years is that the Black Death also spread dramatically into Egypt and up the Nile, took about half of the population of Egypt out and killed it. It was spread throughout many parts of the world that we now call India. And of course, it's mixed up in China with the end of the Mongol rule and the wars that are pushing the Mongols out. So it's kind of hard to disentangle the deaths that come from epidemic disease and those that come from shortages of food and all the other things that come in the wake of war. But we now know that the spread of the Black Death was not a European story only, it's a global story. And we'll get to that when we get to the documents, because mostly the documents that are available put it in the context of being a European story still. And if you Google this, some of these maps, what we'll see is that most of them turn out to be, right, it'll show Western Europe. And the spread of of it from Kaffa on the Black Sea. Just as I think many of you know, this is the Crimean, and this is what Putin just took a couple of years ago. That's exactly where that is. Spread on Italian ships to Venice and to Genoa. And then also we have a document that shows a ship of people who had already died floated into Alexandria harbor. And that's how it spread throughout the Nile. But then you can see these lines that spread the Black Plague all the way up that way. These brown areas are areas that seem to have escaped it as well. And what we know is, and these are big numbers, right? 40 to 60% of all people in Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa died as a result of the spread of the Black Plague. Now there's interesting stories about how and why all that happened, but it really does have to be put into a global context to be able to understand it. And there's a lot of good work that's been done on the structure of the world in 1300 or the 13th century. This is based on work that Abu Lughud did called Europe, or Before European Hegemony. This was done in the late 80s, early 90s. But what she shows is that the world, Eurasia, Afro-Eurasia, had about, depending on how she puts this together and how it's organized, 8 to 10 trading worlds. And these all have their own kinds of dynamics and how they're going and doing things. China, Pacific Ocean, Central Asia, we'll talk about that, the Indian Ocean world. But what's important about these trading circuits is that they, the Venn diagrams, they all overlap in various places. So Europe is not directly connected to China, but it is through Central Asia and those trade circuits. And so the rounds of trade, it's very, very unusual for any single individual to actually conduct trade from one part of this to another, but you've got overlapping, and so goods get transferred from one boat to another, from one caravan to another. And what makes most of this 13th century world system work is not simply that there are all of these, but the fact of the Mongol conquest and the Mongol Empire in the 13th century. So, to get a handle on what's going on with the plague, we've got to deal with Genghis Khan and his grandson. And there's great stories about these guys. Some are worse than others, but you can go on Ancestry.com and find out where your DNA says you're from and how much of this, that, or the other thing you have in it. Geneticists did some testing of Central Asian populations about 20 years ago and found that, I think this is a correct figure, something on the order of 70% of the population has Genghis Khan's DNA. Now, there are several documents and other things that have been, in my view, delicately translated about Genghis Khan and what he said his greatest joy in life was. His greatest joy, my greatest joy in life is taking other people's property, their horses, and caressing their wives and daughters. Well, you know what he's not caressing his wives and daughters. You know what he's doing. He's using rape as a tool of war, is what he's doing, and terror as well. So, don't play with his beard. About 5 years ago, geneticists and others have, in fact, using DNA and other sources, digging up graves of plague victims in England, and then other places as well, being able to show and use, I don't know how they do this, but they've been able to pinpoint the origin of that bacillus to this part. This is now China. This is in Qinghai province, but this is the corridor of the Silk Road, right there. And it came from there. And it also probably was taken by Mongol forces, especially in the 1300s, as Mongol forces to take China moved. They didn't do a direct attack on the center of Chinese power in the lower Yangtze. They came down the west into the province of Yunnan here. And Yunnan, we know, had existence of the plague in 1331, and there were plague outbreaks there. And then they went up this way. So whether or not the plague was taken directly from here with Mongol armies going that direction, or whether it was securitists going down into China first and then getting spread there, we don't quite know exactly how all that works. But we now know exactly where it came from, and it is right there. And we also, here's Kaffa right here. This is the Crimean Peninsula. You don't want to put Russia here, but this is where Kaffa is. And it came as a result of Mongols were besieging Kaffa, trying to take it for any number of reasons, and probably used what we would call biological warfare. They took a member of their party who had plague and flipped his body over the walls into Kaffa. Italian merchants said, got the hell out of town and fled. Fled, we got these. I gotta go back, I should have had this here, right? They take off and head back home as well, with the results, some of which we know about. So I'm sure most of you have a unit on the teaching world history, AP World History will have a unit on the plague, the Black Plague as being an important turning point in world history. But there's, what's interesting, and I want to get to this in just a half a second, I'm going to give you some documents to take a look at. Black Death Online, if you do a search for online sources about the Black Death, they're nearly all going to be European. We have, I couldn't find any sources in Chinese, I couldn't find, then translated, I couldn't find any in Arabic, I couldn't find any, but we do know that the plague decimated those areas as well. We simply don't have documents. So one of the things in the documents that I'm going to give you here to take a look at is that the documents come from, one is from London, one is from Paris, another is a drawing from a Bible in France, and then I've appended two maps. And I just want to point this out to you. The map on the top is a black and white version of the one that I showed you, which is basically the European story of the plague. But then there's it's kind of hard to see because of the way they did this. There's another map down here called the Black Death. But if you look at it carefully, you can see that the Black Death is a global phenomenon in Eurasia. And this raises some of the questions as to, well, why is it that we know only or mostly about the European story of the plague and what it does. Now, these documents are a little bit longer than the ones I gave you before. So, skim through these, you'll get an idea of what's going on. One is called An Ordinance of Laborers in 1349. This is from the King of England. The second is an observer in France, actually in Paris, on the plague, the progress of the Black Plague in Paris in 1348 and 1349. And then the drawing from a Bible, the Toggenburg Bible. I don't know what the Toggenburg Bible is, 1411. And then those maps. Okay, so let's take a quick look at this, see what you make out of these, and again, think about, well, how might we use these in classes? How are students going to deal with this? What kind of stories can we generate out of them, etc. So we've got